Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's talk about one of the most controversial and dangerous schisms in the history of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Moirae Schism. This wasn't just a minor theological dispute or a clash of egos between high-ranking tech priests. No, this was an ideological war that nearly shattered the unity of the machine cult. A rift so profound that even today its echoes can still be felt within the Mechanicus. What made the Moirae Schism so dangerous? Well, it wasn't about simple doctrinal disagreements over machine spirits or the proper way to venerate the Omnissiah. This was a full-blown radical movement that questioned the very foundation of the cult Mechanicus beliefs, shaking the balance between faith, technology, and control. And what's worse, it wasn't just some fringe group of heretics hiding in the depths of some forgotten forge world. The schism took root in the heart of the Mechanicus, spreading like a virus through the hierarchy, threatening to split the organization in two. To this day, there's still debate among fans about just how dangerous this schism really was. Some argue it was one of the closest moments the Mechanicus ever came to total civil war, closer even than the Martian Civil War during the Horus Heresy. Others believe it was merely an internal struggle that was exaggerated over time. But one thing is certain. The Moirae Schism was a defining moment in the history of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a moment when the very nature of their faith and their allegiance to the Imperium was put to the ultimate test. But how did it all begin? What could cause such a massive fracture within the machine cult? To understand that, we need to go back and look at the conditions that allowed the Moirae doctrine to take root in the first place. Let's dive into the origins of this radical movement. The roots of the Moirae Schism run deep into the complex and often secretive world of the Adeptus Mechanicus. To truly understand why this radical cult emerged and why it almost tore the machine cult apart, we have to look at the state of the Mechanicus during that time. This wasn't some random ideological rift that appeared out of nowhere. There were long-standing tensions, hidden fractures within the faith, and deep-seated fears about the true nature of knowledge and prophecy. First, we need to talk about the political and philosophical landscape of the Adeptus Mechanicus before the schism. The cult Mechanicus had always been a strange beast, a fusion of faith and science, of rigid dogma and relentless technological progress. Unlike other imperial institutions, which often relied on blind devotion to the emperor, the Mechanicus was driven by an obsession with knowledge. But this knowledge was shackled by doctrine, by a system of strict rituals and restrictions that determined what could and could not be studied. The cult Mechanicus revered the Omnissiah, the divine embodiment of knowledge and the machine god. But over time, different interpretations of what that truly meant began to form. Some believed that the Omnissiah's will was absolute, that the teachings of the Martian priesthood were infallible, and that deviation was heresy. Others, however, whispered of deeper truths, of hidden knowledge yet to be uncovered. Knowledge that could reshape the entire Adeptus Mechanicus. This division wasn't new. Mars, the beating heart of the Mechanicus, had always been a place of competing ideologies. Even before the Horus Heresy, there had been conflicts between those who sought absolute control over technology and those who believed knowledge should be pursued without restriction. But after the heresy, things became even more complicated. The Mechanicus had been shaken to its core when half of its priesthood had turned to chaos, siding with the Dark Mechanicum. That betrayal left scars that never fully healed. Trust was fragile, paranoia was high, and any deviation from the accepted doctrine was treated with extreme suspicion. But here's where things get really interesting. The Mechanicus wasn't just one monolithic entity. It was made up of different forge worlds, each with its own traditions, rivalries, and interpretations of the faith. Some worlds, especially those closer to Mars, were conservative, adhering strictly to the established laws of the priesthood. Others were more experimental, willing to push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in their search for enlightenment. And then there were the outliers, the ones that constantly tested the limits, often walking a fine line between innovation and outright heresy. One of the major triggers for the Moirae Schism was the growing divide between these different factions. The more radical elements of the Mechanicus had long been frustrated with the dogma enforced by Mars. They saw the strict regulations as a chain, holding back their potential, preventing them from achieving true enlightenment. The conservative factions, on the other hand, viewed these radicals as dangerous, as reckless minds that risked bringing the entire organization to ruin. And then, in the midst of this growing tension, something changed. A new doctrine emerged, one that was both visionary and deeply disturbing. The Moirae doctrine was unlike anything the Mechanicus had seen before. It wasn't just another interpretation of the Omnissiah's will. It was a complete reimagining of what the cult Mechanicus stood for. Its followers claimed to have uncovered a divine pattern, a truth hidden within the flow of time itself. They believed that the Omnissiah's will could be deciphered through mathematical prophecy, that the very structure of the universe contained a blueprint for the future. They saw themselves as the chosen ones, those who had glimpsed the true design of the machine god. And they believed that by following this divine pattern, they could shape the destiny of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and perhaps even the entire Imperium. Now, if you're thinking this sounds a little too close to heresy, you're not alone. Even within the Mechanicus, where logic and faith often blended in strange ways, the idea of using mathematics to predict the will of the Omnissiah was seen as incredibly dangerous. It wasn't just that it challenged the established dogma, it implied that the priesthood of Mars might not be the true interpreters of the machine god's will. And that was a direct threat to the power structure of the Adeptus Mechanicus. But here's the thing. Despite the controversy, the Moirae doctrine spread like wildfire. It resonated with those who had always questioned the rigid traditions of Mars, with those who believed that knowledge should not be limited by superstition. It found a particularly strong following on certain forge worlds that had long chafed under Martian rule, places where innovation had always been seen as something worth fighting for. To them, the Moirae doctrine wasn't heresy, it was liberation. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. The ruling priesthood of Mars, along with the more conservative elements of the Mechanicus, viewed the spread of this doctrine as an existential threat. If the Mechanicus was divided, if faith in the Martian orthodoxy was shaken, it could weaken the entire Imperium. And after the devastation of the Horus heresy, the last thing the Imperium needed was another internal war. The Mechanicus had already lost too much to chaos, and they weren't about to let another radical ideology threaten their fragile unity. So, the lines were drawn. On one side, the followers of the Moirae doctrine, convinced that they had uncovered a hidden truth, something that could change the fate of the Mechanicus forever. On the other, the traditionalists, determined to crush this movement before it could spread any further. The stage was set for one of the most dangerous and bitter conflicts in the history of the cult Mechanicus. And this is where things start to spiral out of control. Because once an idea like this takes hold, it doesn't just disappear. It evolves, it spreads, and eventually, it leads to something far worse: outright war. But before we get to that, we need to take a closer look at what exactly the Moirae doctrine preached and why it was considered so dangerous. The rise of the Moirae doctrine wasn't just a new interpretation of the Adeptus Mechanicus's faith. It was a radical upheaval of everything the machine cult believed in. It wasn't just about how the Omnissiah should be worshipped or how knowledge should be preserved. It was about destiny itself, about whether the future was something to be predicted or something to be shaped. And that terrified the Orthodox priesthood of Mars. The core belief of the Moirae cult was simple but profound. They claimed to have discovered a divine mathematical pattern embedded in the fabric of reality itself. According to them, the Omnissiah's will wasn't something that had to be interpreted through ancient rites or cryptic scripture. It could be calculated. The universe, they argued, was governed by an intricate code, a grand equation that determined the course of all events. If one could decipher this code, they could predict the future. And more than that, they could influence it. Now, at first glance, this might not seem all that different from the standard beliefs of the Mechanicus. After all, the cult Mechanicus already operated on the idea that knowledge was sacred, and that the machine god's wisdom was woven into the structure of existence. But the Moirae cult took this idea to its extreme. To them, it wasn't enough to study the mysteries of the Omnissiah. They sought to unlock the fundamental algorithm of the universe itself, to calculate the unfolding of time in a way that bordered on prophecy. They believed that through advanced mathematical formulas, hidden within the sacred logic of the machine god, they could glimpse the inevitable future and act accordingly. This idea alone would have been enough to put them at odds with the more conservative factions of the Mechanicus, but what truly made them dangerous was what they did with this knowledge. The Moirae cult didn't see their insights as mere philosophical musings or theoretical exercises. They believed that they were obligated to act on them. If their calculations revealed that a certain technology would bring disaster, they would move to destroy it, regardless of whether the priesthood of Mars had sanctioned it. If they foresaw the downfall of a particular forge world, they would abandon it, even if it meant defying the will of the Fabricator General. And if their equations told them that the Adeptus Mechanicus itself was heading toward a crisis, they believed it was their duty to reshape its future, by any means necessary. This was the breaking point. The idea of divine mathematics was one thing, but the notion that these radicals could use it to justify defying the authority of Mars? That was unacceptable. The entire structure of the Adeptus Mechanicus was built on hierarchy and tradition. The priesthood functioned as an iron-fisted ruling body, controlling not just the flow of knowledge, but the very way in which it could be understood. The Moirae doctrine threatened to undermine that completely. If their teachings spread, the authority of the priesthood of Mars wouldn't just be challenged, it could be rendered obsolete. And let's be real, if there's one thing the Adeptus Mechanicus doesn't tolerate, it's threats to its control. The cult Mechanicus had spent millennia enforcing its doctrines with an almost religious zeal, ensuring that no knowledge fell into the hands of those deemed unworthy. The idea that a rogue sect could claim to have a more accurate interpretation of the Omnissiah's will? That was heresy of the highest order. And unlike other forms of heresy, this one wasn't rooted in ignorance or rebellion. It was rooted in cold, logical precision. That made it even more dangerous. The divide between the Moirae cult and the Orthodox Mechanicus only grew deeper as more tech priests started questioning their own beliefs. Some saw the Moirae doctrine as blasphemy, an affront to the sacred traditions that had guided the Adeptus Mechanicus since its inception. Others saw it as the next step in their evolution, a revelation that could lead to a greater understanding of the machine god. And then there were those who weren't sure what to believe, torn between their loyalty to Mars and the undeniable allure of the Moirae's supposed insights. And this is where things start getting even more complicated. Because if there's one thing we know about the Mechanicus, it's that secrecy and paranoia are built into its very core. The more the priesthood of Mars tried to suppress the Moirae doctrine, the more it spread. The Moirae cultists weren't just radical thinkers, they were brilliant strategists. They knew that their teachings were dangerous, so they adapted, hiding their knowledge in encrypted data vaults, disguising their findings within layers of code and subroutines, embedding their ideas in places where the Mechanicus's own systems couldn't purge them. Some even speculate that they had sympathizers in high places, individuals who secretly supported their cause but were too afraid to reveal themselves. And honestly, that wouldn't be surprising. For every vocal opponent of the Moirae doctrine, there were just as many who hesitated, who saw the logic in their ideas but feared what would happen if they aligned themselves too openly. Of course, not everyone was content to sit back and watch. As the schism grew, both sides began taking more drastic measures. The traditionalists doubled down, purging suspected cultists, locking down access to forbidden knowledge, and reinforcing their control over the Mechanicus's data networks. Meanwhile, the Moirae cult became more radical, more secretive, and more willing to fight for what they believed was the inevitable future. At this point, the Moirae Schism wasn't just a theoretical debate or a minor theological dispute. It was an ideological war waiting to happen. The Mechanicus had always operated under the belief that knowledge was power, but now that belief was turning against itself. Because if the Moirae doctrine was right, if they truly had glimpsed the future, then the question wasn't just what they knew. It was what they were willing to do with it, and that's when everything started spiraling toward outright conflict. The schism had been brewing in the shadows, but soon it would explode into open warfare. The Mechanicus was about to face one of the greatest internal crises in its history, a war not fought over territory or resources, but over the very nature of its faith. But before that war began, the leadership of the Adeptus Mechanicus had to make a choice. Would they try to negotiate? Would they attempt to bring the radicals back into the fold? Or would they do what they had always done to those who defied them, wipe them out completely? At first, the conflict between the Moirae cult and the Orthodox Mechanicus wasn't fought with plasma weapons and Titan legions. It started in whispers, in backroom debates, in encrypted transmissions between Forge worlds that had quietly pledged themselves to the new doctrine. It was a war of ideas before it became a war of steel, a battle fought in the halls of power, in the shadows of data vaults, and in the hearts of the tech priests themselves. But like all wars, it couldn't stay in the shadows forever. The first real signs of trouble came when certain Forge worlds began withholding resources from Mars. This was unprecedented. The Adeptus Mechanicus functioned like a massive, interconnected machine, each Forge world playing its part in the greater whole. The flow of materials, technology, and sacred knowledge was regulated with mere religious discipline. But suddenly, key shipments of weapons, STC fragments, and even entire research archives simply stopped reaching their intended destinations. At first, Mars tried to downplay the situation. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe there were supply chain issues due to warp storms. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. These worlds weren't just refusing to cooperate. They were making a statement. For the more radical followers of the Moirae doctrine, this was the first step toward breaking free from the constraints of Mars. They saw themselves as pioneers, not heretics. Why should they continue to obey the decrees of an outdated, rigid hierarchy when they had seen the future? They believed that by breaking away, they could guide the Adeptus Mechanicus down the correct path, one dictated not by blind tradition, but by the mathematical certainty of their calculations. To them, Mars wasn't just another Forge world. It was an obstacle, a relic of the past standing in the way of progress. But the ruling priesthood of Mars saw things very differently. From their perspective, the Moirae doctrine wasn't just dangerous, it was outright rebellion. The Adeptus Mechanicus had endured for millennia because it had structure, because it had discipline. If Forge worlds started thinking they could act on their own, if they started believing that they could dictate their own version of the Omnissiah's will, then the entire fabric of the machine cult would unravel. And if that happened, it wouldn't just be the Mechanicus that suffered. It would be the entire Imperium. The Adeptus Mechanicus was the lifeblood of the Imperium's war machine. And if it fractured, humanity's already tenuous hold on survival would weaken even further. The Fabricator General of Mars, who, by this point, had been dealing with growing paranoia about heresy ever since the Horus Heresy, decided that the time for patience was over. If the Moirae cult wanted to break away, then they would be made an example of. But here's where things get interesting. Mars didn't immediately respond with fire and blood. No, at first, they tried to handle things politically. High-ranking representatives of the Orthodox Mechanicus were sent to the most outspoken Moirae-aligned Forge worlds under the guise of diplomatic missions. In reality, these were not peaceful envoys. They were inquisitors in red robes, tasked with rooting out the heresy from within. Some of these missions ended with forced re-education, where high-ranking Moirae supporters were dragged before councils of senior magi and ordered to recant their beliefs. Those who complied were allowed to live, though under strict surveillance. Those who refused were quietly removed. There were whispers of tech priests disappearing overnight, their data spheres wiped clean, their existence erased from the Mechanicus archives. But the radicals weren't defenseless. They had seen this coming, and they had prepared. The more militant elements of the Moirae cult knew that if Mars pushed too hard, there would be no turning back. Some of them had already begun forming hidden networks of loyalists, stockpiling weapons, and even reprogramming servitor legions in case things escalated. They had no intention of surrendering their beliefs without a fight. The first real battle of the Moirae Schism wasn't fought in space, nor was it fought with grand armies. It took place in the depths of a Forge world's data vaults, where a single, devastating purge was enacted. One of the high-ranking representatives from Mars, an influential archmagos known for his ruthless efficiency, arrived on a Forge world suspected of harboring Moirae sympathizers. He was there to negotiate, to demand loyalty. But before he could even begin his mission, his entire retinue was systematically wiped out. Every data node connected to Mars was severed. Every piece of Mechanicus intelligence in their systems was erased. In one swift, calculated strike, the Moirae cultists had declared their independence. This was the spark that ignited the war. The priesthood of Mars could no longer pretend this was just a philosophical debate or a minor deviation. This was open defiance, and the response was immediate. Entire fleets of Mechanicus warships were dispatched, Skitarii legions were mobilized, and orders were sent to bring the rogue Forge worlds back into compliance, by force if necessary. The battles that followed were unlike anything the Imperium had seen before. This wasn't a war between humans and Xenos, or between the Emperor's servants and the forces of chaos. This was a war fought with the same weapons, the same technology, the same cold, ruthless efficiency that had made the Mechanicus so powerful in the first place. Cybernetic assassins were deployed on both sides, infiltrating enemy command structures and taking out key leaders before they could give orders. Skitarii kill teams waged brutal skirmishes in the depths of Forge cities, fighting street by street to secure manufactorums and data libraries. Some battles weren't fought with guns at all, but with data. Hacking wars waged in the noosphere, where entire legions of servitors were turned against their masters with a single corrupted command. One of the most infamous moments of the early conflict came when a fleet of Mars loyalist warships attempted to blockade a Moirae-aligned Forge world, hoping to starve them into submission. But instead of surrendering, the radicals enacted a desperate gambit. Using predictive algorithms, ones they claimed had been derived from the divine pattern itself, they calculated the precise moment when a nearby warp anomaly would destabilize. Then, using heretical gravitic manipulation technology, they triggered an artificial warp rift, pulling an entire segment of the blockade fleet into the immaterium before it could react. To the radicals, this was proof of their doctrine's truth. To Mars, it was an unforgivable act of treason. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the bloodshed, there were still those within the Mechanicus who hesitated. Not everyone on Mars believed the Fabricator General was handling this the right way. Some whispered that the Moirae cultists weren't entirely wrong, that maybe, just maybe, their calculations had merit. But by this point, doubt was a dangerous thing. The war had started, and there was no going back. The Moirae Schism was no longer just a theoretical conflict between ideologies. It was now a full-scale war for the soul of the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the worst was yet to come. Because while the initial battles had been brutal, they were just the beginning. The true war, the one that would determine the fate of the Mechanicus, was still to come. The Moirae Schism had already caused deep fractures within the Adeptus Mechanicus, but for a time it remained a war of ideas. Political maneuvering and secret purges. That changed when Mars decided that words and decrees were no longer enough. When diplomacy failed, when subtlety proved ineffective, the Fabricator General and his loyalist Forge worlds turned to the one thing the Mechanicus had always excelled at: war. The first real battles of the Schism weren't fought with grand armies, but with precision strikes. Entire manufactorums were shut down overnight as Mechanicus kill teams, cybernetically enhanced assassins, Skitarii vanguard, and elite tech priests descended upon Forge worlds suspected of harboring Moirae sympathizers. These weren't simple purges. They were surgical exterminations. Key magi, data vault keepers, and high-ranking priests who had been suspected of spreading the heretical doctrine were executed in their sanctums, their minds scrubbed from the noosphere as if they had never existed. But the radicals were prepared. If the Moirae doctrine had taught them anything, it was that inevitability could be calculated. They had foreseen this response, anticipated the moment when Mars would move against them, and they had made their own preparations. Entire sections of the Forge worlds under their control had been fortified in secret, Their defenses reinforced with ancient technologies that had long been considered too unstable or too dangerous to use. One of the first true battles of the Schism erupted on a forge world whose name has been lost to time, purged from Mechanicus records, as if the conflict itself was an embarrassment they wanted to forget. But those who study the history of the Schism know it as one of the most brutal examples of what happens when the Mechanicus turns its weapons on itself. The opening shots weren't plasma bolts or macro cannon fire. They were pulses of raw, weaponized data. The radicals struck first, unleashing an unleashed noospheric plague that tore through the loyalist systems, corrupting servitor networks, turning automated defense grids against their own masters. For hours, the loyalist forces fought not against the Moirae cultists themselves, but against their own machines. Skitarii legions turned on each other as their command signals were overridden, entire sections of the Forge City falling into chaos as ancient constructs, buried deep within the world's data vaults, were awakened and turned against their former masters. Then came the real war. Loyalist forces landed in full, bringing with them the might of Mars. The Omnissiah's wrath, an entire battalion of Skitarii shock troops, descended upon the rebellious world, supported by maniples of Castellan robots, their cortexes bound to the will of their magi handlers. The radicals, however, did not fight like conventional soldiers. They used predictive warfare, calculating where the enemy would strike before they even arrived, setting traps that disrupted the carefully maintained supply lines of the loyalist forces. The most terrifying weapons deployed during this war weren't the usual Mechanicus constructs. They were things that had been locked away for centuries, considered too dangerous even for the cult Mechanicus. There are whispers of war engines powered by minds that had been fused with forbidden knowledge, constructs that could rewrite battlefield data in real time, shifting reality itself as the battle unfolded. Some claim that the radicals had unearthed pre-heresy weapons, relics of a time when the Mechanicus was not bound by Imperial dogma. Others believe they had unlocked something worse, technologies that should have never been used, even in war. But as devastating as these battles were, they were still only the beginning. The Schism had reached the point of no return. Forge worlds began declaring open allegiance to one side or the other, and what had once been isolated conflicts turned into full-scale war. The battlefield stretched across entire star systems, with Mechanicus warships engaging in brutal void battles, Titan legions clashing against each other in apocalyptic duels, and hidden Mechanicus cults waging information wars in the depths of the noosphere. One of the most infamous moments of the war came when a Moirae-aligned Forge world attempted to break a Martian blockade by using what can only be described as predictive warp navigation. Normally, travel through the warp is an unpredictable nightmare, even with the guidance of a navigator. But the Moirae cultists believed they could bypass that uncertainty, using their calculations to create what they called a predetermined warp path. The theory was that if the universe truly followed a mathematical design, then the movements of the warp could be predicted just like any other force of nature. It worked, at least partially. Their fleet emerged precisely where they intended, bypassing the Martian blockade entirely. But something had gone horribly wrong. The ships were intact, but the crews were altered. Reports from surviving loyalist forces described the Moirae fleet as operating with an eerie precision, as if every action had been preordained. The crews barely spoke, their movements mechanical, their reactions almost too perfect. And the ships themselves pulsed with strange energies, their machine spirits behaving in ways that no tech priest could explain. Some believe the radicals had succeeded in unlocking something that was never meant to be understood. Others claim they had simply played with forces they couldn't control. Either way, the ships disappeared soon after, vanishing into the void without a trace. The war reached its peak when the first Titan-on-Titan battles erupted. The Collegia Titanica, normally a unified force within the Adeptus Mechanicus, found itself split. Entire Titan legions turned on each other, with Warlord and Reaver Titans laying waste to Forge cities that had stood for millennia. The devastation was beyond anything the Imperium had seen since the Horus Heresy, with some battles rendering entire worlds uninhabitable, their manufactorums reduced to little more than slag. Yet despite all this destruction, the war never truly had a decisive moment. There was no grand final battle, no singular victory that ended the conflict once and for all. Instead, it ground on, a slow, brutal war of attrition, where both sides suffered immensely. Some Forge worlds, seeing the devastation, chose to surrender, offering their allegiance to Mars once more in exchange for survival. Others simply went silent, their fates unknown, lost to the chaos of war. What made this conflict so terrifying was that it was fought between those who understood technology better than anyone else in the Imperium. Unlike the endless meat-grinder battles of the Astra Militarum, where billions of soldiers were thrown into the fire, this was a war of precision. Every engagement was calculated. Every move was based on raw logic and probability. And yet, despite all that precision, despite all that cold, machine-like reasoning, the schism was driven by something deeply human: faith, ambition, and the fear of the unknown. As the war dragged on, both sides began to realize that there could be no true victory. The Adeptus Mechanicus could not afford to remain divided, not while the Imperium faced so many external threats. And so, as the battles raged, a new question began to take shape: not who would win, but how this war would end. Because if something wasn't done soon, there might not be anything left of the Mechanicus to save. The Imperium of Man is a vast, sprawling nightmare of bureaucracy, religious fanaticism, and barely contained chaos. Normally, what happens within the Adeptus Mechanicus is their business. So long as they keep producing weapons, ships, and war machines, the wider Imperium doesn't ask too many questions. But the Moirae Schism wasn't just another internal dispute. It was something far worse. It was a fracture within one of the Imperium's most vital institutions, a crack that, if left unchecked, could weaken the entire war machine of humanity. And that was something the Imperium could not afford. At first, the High Lords of Terra and the wider Imperial hierarchy largely ignored the conflict. The Mechanicus had always been an enigma, a strange mix of religion and technology that most Imperial officials didn't fully understand. To them, the idea of a schism within the machine cult was just another example of the Mechanicus doing what it always did: arguing over knowledge, hoarding secrets, and engaging in bizarre theological disputes. It was treated as little more than a minor inconvenience, something that Mars would sort out on its own. But as the war escalated, as entire Forge worlds went dark, as Titan legions and Skitarii forces clashed in battles that left entire systems crippled, the Imperium started to take notice. It wasn't just about the Mechanicus fighting itself anymore. It was about production quotas falling, about vital shipments of weapons and ammunition failing to reach the Astra Militarum, about fleet construction slowing to a crawl. And when the war threatened to spill beyond the boundaries of the Mechanicus itself, when Imperial supply lines were disrupted, when entire sectors faced economic collapse due to the destruction of key manufactorums, the Imperium realized it had no choice but to intervene. But how do you intervene in a war between the most advanced, technologically powerful minds in the galaxy? The Imperium couldn't simply send in the Astra Militarum. Regular human soldiers, even those of the elite Tempestus Scions, would be slaughtered in seconds against the mechanized war machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus. And the Inquisition? That was a delicate matter. The Mechanicus had always been semi-autonomous, operating under its own laws, its own religious doctrine. An open inquisitorial purge would have risked turning even the loyalist factions of the Mechanicus against the wider Imperium. And the Imperium could not afford to alienate Mars, not when it was already stretched thin fighting countless wars on all fronts. So instead, the Imperium opted for something more subtle. Diplomatic envoys were sent, shadowy figures from the Adeptus Terra and the Officio Perfectus, tasked with finding a way to end the conflict without further destabilizing the Imperium. There were quiet meetings in the deepest vaults of Terra, whispered negotiations between Imperial officials and the Fabricator General, discussions about how best to contain the schism. But beneath all the political maneuvering, one thing was clear: the Imperium was not going to allow this war to continue indefinitely. And then there was the question of faith. The Imperium is built on the worship of the Emperor as the divine god of mankind, a belief that has shaped its every institution, except for one. The Adeptus Mechanicus has always been an anomaly, a religious order that does not worship the emperor in the same way as the rest of the Imperium. They revere the Omnissiah, a machine god whose nature has been debated for millennia. And that's where things got complicated. Because the Moirae cultists, they didn't just believe in mathematical prophecy. They believed that the Omnissiah's will was manifesting in ways that could be deciphered, that the future was something that could be understood and altered. And some among them took this idea even further. They began to whisper that the true Omnissiah, the true will of the machine god, was not the emperor at all. Some claimed that their calculations had revealed a coming revelation, a moment when the true nature of the Omnissiah would be unveiled. Others suggested that the Imperium itself was merely a temporary structure, a stepping stone towards something far greater. To the Imperium, this was heresy of the highest order. The ecclesiarchy, which normally had little direct influence over the Mechanicus, suddenly took an interest. Cardinal priests on Terra began demanding action, calling for a full-scale inquisitorial purge of the radicals. They saw the Moirae cult not just as a threat to the Mechanicus, but as a possible infection that could spread into the wider Imperium. If the idea that the Omnissiah was something other than the Emperor took hold, it could shake the very foundation of Imperial faith. But the Inquisition was more divided. Some inquisitors agreed that the cult was a direct threat, an existential danger that needed to be eradicated. Others, however, saw an opportunity. If the Moirae doctrine truly could predict the future, then it could be weaponized. Some inquisitors began quietly seeking out Moirae-aligned tech priests, hoping to extract whatever knowledge they had before they were purged. There are even rumors that some factions within the Imperium, particularly among the Ordo Xenos and Ordo Malleus, tried to harness Moirae technology for their own ends, seeing it as a tool that could be used against the Imperium's enemies. But for all the secrecy, for all the hidden negotiations and covert dealings, one fact remained undeniable. The war was spiraling out of control. The Imperium could not afford to let the schism continue unchecked. And so, pressure began mounting on Mars to bring an end to the conflict, by any means necessary. At the same time, the Moirae cultists found themselves at a crossroads. Some of them had believed that the Imperium might support them, that the wider Imperium might see the flaws in the Mechanicus' rigid orthodoxy and recognize the value of their teachings. But that hope quickly died. The Imperium had no interest in philosophical debates or technological revolutions. It cared only about stability, about keeping the Mechanicus functioning so that its war machine could continue grinding forward. And so the Moirae cult found itself increasingly isolated. The Imperium wasn't going to save them, and neither were their more moderate allies within the Mechanicus. They were alone, trapped between the wrath of Mars and the cold indifference of Terra. Some among the radicals began to realize that they had miscalculated. They had believed that knowledge, that understanding, that pure logic would be enough to change the fate of the Mechanicus. But they had underestimated the power of tradition, of faith, of raw, unrelenting dogma. The Imperium was not a place where ideas triumphed. It was a place where power dictated truth. And so, as the war dragged on, as the Imperium tightened its grip and Mars prepared its final moves, the Moirae cultists faced the most difficult question of all. What would they do when there was nowhere left to run? Would they fight to the last, refusing to abandon their beliefs? Would they attempt to escape, seeking refuge in the dark corners of the galaxy? Or would they take the ultimate risk, one final desperate gamble to force the future they had foreseen into reality? That decision would determine the final fate of the schism. And what came next would shake the Adeptus Mechanicus forever. The end of the Moirae Schism was as chaotic as its beginning. But if there's one thing the Adeptus Mechanicus excels at, it's ensuring that history remembers only what is convenient. The final days of the conflict were not marked by a single decisive battle, but rather by a slow, crushing inevitability. The same kind of inevitability that the Moirae cultists had built their entire philosophy around. They had calculated every outcome, mapped out every possibility, yet they had failed to account for one thing: the raw, unrelenting force of Mechanicus orthodoxy. By the time the schism reached its final phase, the radicals were already on the defensive. The initial momentum they had gained through their predictive warfare, Their superior understanding of the battlefield and their use of forbidden technology had started to collapse under the sheer logistical might of Mars and its allies. The Mechanicus did not simply fight with weapons. They fought with numbers, with supply chains, with an infrastructure that had survived the Horus heresy and continued to fuel the Imperium's endless wars. And now, that same system turned its focus entirely on crushing the schism once and for all. The first real sign that the end was near came when one of the major Moirae-aligned Forge worlds, one that had been a key player in the conflict, suddenly went dark. No transmissions, no distress signals, nothing. Loyalist forces cautiously advanced, expecting an ambush, but what they found was far stranger. The world was still intact, its manufactorums still running, but every tech priest, every Skitari, every servitor had simply ceased functioning. Some were found frozen in place, their minds seemingly wiped clean. Others had been fused into their machines, their consciousness trapped in endless looping subroutines. The noosphere itself had been scrambled beyond repair, corrupted with data that defied analysis. Some believe this was the result of a final, desperate experiment by the Moirae cultists, an attempt to ascend beyond physical existence, to merge fully with the predictive code they had worshipped. Others think it was a last-ditch effort to deny Mars the satisfaction of reclaiming their world. Whatever the truth, that Forge world was declared unfit for habitation and quarantined indefinitely. But that was just the beginning. Across multiple war zones, Moirae forces began making increasingly erratic moves. Some attempted to escape, retreating into the dark corners of the galaxy, seeking refuge in places where even the Mechanicus feared to tread. Others made desperate last stands, activating experimental weapons that burned themselves out in apocalyptic bursts of energy. There are even accounts of entire armies vanishing mid-battle, their movements so precisely calculated that it was as if they had simply stepped out of time itself. Whether this was a malfunction of their own predictive algorithms or something far more terrifying remains unknown. The true breaking point came when Mars enacted its final decree, an absolute purge of every trace of the Moirae doctrine. This wasn't just about wiping out the remaining radicals, this was about erasing their very existence. Data vaults were scoured, records deleted, entire archives burned. Any tech priest found harboring Moirae knowledge was executed on the spot. Even those who had remained neutral were forced to undergo intense noospheric interrogation to ensure that no remnants of the heresy remained in their minds. The Fabricator General himself decreed that the Moirae Schism had never happened, that it was an anomaly best left forgotten. And so, the Mechanicus did what it always did, rewrote history. But here's where things get interesting. If the Moirae were truly wiped out, if their doctrine was purged so completely, why do fragments of it still exist? Why do certain forbidden data archives still reference their work, hidden behind layers of encryption? And why do some of the most advanced, seemingly miraculous feats of the Mechanicus bear traces of their predictive algorithms? Some believe that the Moirae weren't truly destroyed, that remnants of their knowledge were absorbed into the Mechanicus itself. That even the most orthodox tech priests secretly use the very same calculations that they once called heresy. And then there's the biggest mystery of all: what happened to Erastes? The so-called prophet of the Moirae doctrine was never found. No body, no confirmed execution, nothing. Some say he was killed in the final days of the war, that his followers wiped all record of his existence to prevent him from being turned into a martyr. Others believe he succeeded in escaping, vanishing into the noosphere, becoming something more than human, his mind now a ghost in the machine. And then there are the wildest theories, the ones that suggest that the Moirae were right all along, that they truly had glimpsed the future, and that somewhere, hidden deep in the void, they are still waiting for the moment their prophecy foretold. The Moirae Schism officially ended with Mars declaring victory, with the Mechanicus reaffirming its unity, its unshakable devotion to the Omnissiah. But like all great conflicts, it left scars. There are still whispers, still those who seek fragments of the lost doctrine, still those who wonder if the Moirae were truly defeated or if they simply became something else. Because if they really had uncovered the future, if they really had seen what was to come, then maybe, just maybe, they're still out there, watching waiting, preparing for the day when their calculations finally prove correct. The Moirae Schism may have been erased from official records, but history, real history, doesn't disappear just because someone in red robes decides it should. The Mechanicus might claim that the war ended with their total victory, that the radicals were wiped out, their doctrine purged, their teachings forgotten. But if that were true, then why do so many strange anomalies still persist in the Mechanicus's vast, labyrinthine network of data? Why do some tech priests, even in the modern age of the 41st millennium, still whisper about the pattern in hushed tones, as if it's some ancient ghost waiting to return? The truth is, the Moirae Schism left a scar on the Adeptus Mechanicus, one that never fully healed. Even though the radicals were hunted to extinction, their ideas, some of them at least, survived. And in the Mechanicus, ideas are more dangerous than any weapon. There are traces of the Moirae doctrine hidden in places that even the most dogmatic of tech priests cannot deny. Certain data algorithms, certain predictive models used in high-level Mechanicus calculations, bear a striking resemblance to the so-called heretical formulas the Moirae once swore by. Some say these are just remnants, leftovers from a time long past. Others believe the Mechanicus secretly absorbed parts of the Moirae's teachings, integrating them into their own systems while publicly denying that they ever had any merit. And then there's the issue of probability forecasting. The Mechanicus has always used logic and statistical modeling to predict outcomes, but some of the more advanced predictive systems, especially those used by the most elite Forge worlds, seem eerily similar to what the Moirae once preached. It raises an uncomfortable question. Did the Mechanicus truly destroy the Moirae cult, or did they simply strip away the parts they didn't like and keep the rest? Even stranger is the fact that some of the most radical Forge worlds today, the ones constantly pushing the boundaries of Mechanicus doctrine, have methods that echo those of the Moirae cultists. Forge worlds like Styges the Eight, known for their secrecy and obsession with hidden knowledge, have long been suspected of harboring remnants of lost doctrines. And then there's the issue of the Black Ships and the Inquisition's dealings with certain Mechanicus factions. Some inquisitors have hinted that there are tech priests who still practice a form of calculated prophecy, using arcane systems that look disturbingly similar to what the Moirae were executed for. If that's true, then it means that the schism never really ended. It just went underground. But the biggest question, the one that still keeps some within the Mechanicus awake in their cold cybernetic shells, is this. What if the Moirae cult was right? What if they really had discovered the pattern of the universe, the hidden code that dictates all of reality? If that were the case, then what did they see? And more importantly, what did the Fabricator General and his enforcers see that made them so desperate to shut it down? Because that's the thing. The Mechanicus has dealt with heresy before. They've fought against rogue tech priests, hunted down cybernetic abominations, even battled entire Forge worlds that turned to chaos. But none of those events were wiped from history the way the Moirae Schism was. That level of secrecy, that level of purging, suggests that what the Moirae discovered wasn't just dangerous. It was something the Mechanicus itself feared. Some believe the Moirae saw the death of the Mechanicus, that their calculations predicted an unavoidable collapse of the machine cult, one that no amount of dogma or tradition could prevent. Others think they foresaw something even worse, an event so catastrophic that it would rewrite the fate of the Imperium itself. There are even wilder theories, ones that claim the Moirae stumbled upon the truth about the Omnissiah, about the Emperor, about the nature of the machine god itself. And if that's the case, then maybe their extermination wasn't about protecting the Mechanicus at all. Maybe it was about protecting a secret that Mars never wanted anyone to know. Even now, in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, whispers of the Moirae doctrine persist. Data ghosts flicker in forgotten archives, corrupted code appears in places it shouldn't, and every once in a while, a tech priest disappears under mysterious circumstances, rumored to have been caught studying something they shouldn't have. It's as if the Mechanicus itself is still haunted by the echoes of the schism, by the possibility that somewhere, somehow, the Moirae prophecy is still playing out exactly as it was calculated. And if that's true, then the real question isn't whether the Moirae cult was destroyed. The real question is whether they ever truly lost. The Moirae Schism is one of those stories that the Adeptus Mechanicus would prefer to be forgotten, buried beneath layers of redacted data and erased archives. But for those who look closely, who dig through the remnants of old records and whispers in hidden Mechanicus networks, the truth is clear. It was one of the greatest internal crises the machine cult has ever faced, and it might not be the last. What makes the Moirae Schism so fascinating isn't just the war, the secret purges, or the fact that the Mechanicus tried so hard to wipe it from history. It's the deeper implications of what it represented. The schism wasn't just about heresy or rebellion. It was about the nature of knowledge itself, about the battle between rigid dogma and the pursuit of forbidden truths. It was about the fear that somewhere, deep within the logic of the universe, there might be something that even the Mechanicus isn't ready to face. And that raises a terrifying question. Could it happen again? Could another schism, just as devastating, just as divisive, break the unity of the Adeptus Mechanicus in the future? The answer is almost certainly yes. The Mechanicus thrives on knowledge, but it is also bound by a paradox. It worships technology, but fears innovation. It hoards understanding, but refuses to question its own limitations. That contradiction has created tension for millennia, and the Moirae Schism was just one example of what happens when that tension finally snaps. If history tells us anything, it's that ideas never truly die. Even after a movement is crushed, after its followers are hunted down, after its teachings are erased from every official record, some fragment of it always survives. A piece of data buried in a forgotten archive, a half-decoded script locked away in a forbidden vault, a tech priest who begins to question just a little too much. The Mechanicus may have won the war, but the Moirae cult's core belief that the universe follows a hidden mathematical pattern was never truly disproven. And that means there will always be those who seek to rediscover it. What if, somewhere in the vast cold depths of the Imperium, a tech priest is already running calculations, already finding hints of the same divine code that started this war so long ago? What if there are forge worlds experimenting with forbidden technology, trying to glimpse the future? And what if, this time, the Mechanicus isn't able to erase them so easily? It's not hard to imagine a second schism, another fracture within the machine cult, where radicals once again rise up in pursuit of knowledge deemed too dangerous to exist. And this time, the Imperium might not be able to contain it. The Mechanicus has always been the backbone of the Imperium's war machine, but what happens when the backbone begins to break? In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, the Imperium is already stretched to its breaking point. The Great Rift has torn reality apart, chaos is stronger than ever, Xeno's threats are multiplying, and even the Emperor's own realm is crumbling under the weight of war. The Mechanicus is the only thing keeping the Imperium's army supplied, keeping its fleets running, keeping the vast, decaying infrastructure from completely falling apart. If another schism were to happen, if the Adeptus Mechanicus were to split again, it might not be something the Imperium could recover from. And maybe that's the real reason the Moirae Schism was erased from history. Not because the Mechanicus was ashamed of it, but because they knew it could happen again. Because they knew that somewhere, sometime, someone would start asking the same questions. And when that day comes, when the cycle repeats, the Imperium will once again be forced to decide whether knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance. So what do you think? Was the Moirae Schism just another footnote in the long, bloody history of the Imperium? Or was it a warning of something bigger, something still waiting to unfold? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the Mechanicus's darkest secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next lore breakdown. Because in a universe as vast and mysterious as Warhammer 40k, there are always more secrets waiting to be uncovered.